Welcome, weary traveler, to the shadowed halls of forgotten knowledge. I am your keeper of ancient lore, guardian of truths too perilous for common tongues. Tonight, as darkness settles upon the world and sleep beckons, I shall unveil to you a secret that has slumbered in the deepest vaults of Rivendell for long ages, the true nature of the Witch-King's immortality, and the forbidden prophecy that bound his fate to powers beyond mortal comprehension. Let your eyes grow heavy as we journey together through mists of time, where prophecy and doom intertwine like lovers in an eternal dance. Close your eyes, surrender to the rhythm of ancient words, and let the shadows of this tale carry you into dreams of Middle-earth's most closely guarded mysteries. Breathe deeply now, and prepare your spirit for revelations that shall echo through the chambers of your slumber. In the uttermost east, where the great shadow of Mordor stretched its tendrils across the dying lands, there moved a figure that defied the very foundations of life and death. The Witch-King of Angmar, Lord of the Nine, chief among the Nazgul, walked between worlds like a living wound in reality itself. His form, draped in robes that seemed to devour light, cast no shadow upon the ground, for he himself had become shadow made manifest. Those who gazed upon him in his terrible majesty spoke not of a warrior or a king, but of something far more unsettling, a presence that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between breath and exhalation. His crown, wreathed in cold flame, bore no jewels, for what need had he of earthly treasures when he possessed something far more precious and terrible, the curse of endless existence. For centuries beyond count, he had walked the paths of Middle-earth, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. Armies fell before his advance, not merely because of his power, but because of the wrongness that emanated from his very being. He was a paradox wrapped in mail and shadow, invulnerable yet hollow, immortal, yet denied the peace of true life. His voice, when it chose to speak, carried the weight of eons, each word a whisper from the threshold between worlds. But this immortality, this terrible suspension between states of being, had not been born of mere sorcery or the dominion of his ring alone. Nay, the roots of his doom stretched far deeper into the very fabric of prophecy itself. Long before the darkness of Angmar spread across the northern lands, long before the forging of the Nine, ancient voices had whispered of his fate in words that mortals could scarce comprehend. The question that haunted the wise was not how he had achieved such terrible immortality, but why the very cosmos seemed to conspire to preserve him in his tormented state. What force had woven his doom so thoroughly into the tapestry of fate that even death itself recoiled from his presence? The sun hung low over the battlefield at Fornost, painting the trampled earth in shades of amber and blood. Victory hung in the air like morning mist, yet there was no joy in the hearts of the victorious. For though the Witch-King's host had been scattered like leaves before the storm, and his fortress of Carn Dûm lay in ruins, there lingered still an unease that no amount of triumph could dispel. Glorfindel stood upon the field, his golden hair stirring in the wind that carried the scent of distant snow. The elf lord's eyes, ancient beyond mortal reckoning, gazed not at the fallen enemy but through the veils of time itself. In that moment of supposed victory, visions danced before him like phantoms in firelight, glimpses of futures yet unborn, of dooms yet to unfold. The assembled warriors watched as his lips parted, and from them flowed words that would echo through the ages. Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. But those who heard these words understood only their surface meaning, as a child might glimpse the moon's reflection in still water without comprehending the celestial body that cast it. For Glorfindel's prophecy was layered like the leaves of an ancient tome, each word carefully chosen to conceal as much as it revealed. The phrase, "not by the hand of man," was spoken not as a limitation of gender, but as a riddle wrapping a far more terrible truth. The Witch-King's doom was bound by forces that transcended mortal understanding, a curse woven into the very essence of his being, making him untouchable to ordinary death, even as it denied him the peace of ordinary life. As the Elf Lord spoke, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of prophecy. His words were not mere prediction, but recognition, the acknowledgement of a doom already written in the stars, already woven into the music of creation itself. The Witch-King's spirit, though fled from the field, remained bound by chains forged in the uttermost beginning of the world. Why, the wise would later wonder, had Glorfindel chosen to shroud such crucial knowledge in riddle and metaphor? What purpose did such concealment serve if not to protect those who heard from truths too terrible for mortal minds to bear? Deep beneath the gentle domes of Rivendell, where starlight filtered through ancient crystal and the very stones seemed to hum with remembered song, lay archives that even Elrond half-elven opened but rarely. These chambers, carved from the living rock in the elder days, held secrets that predated the rise of kingdoms and the fall of kings. Here, in silence broken only by the whisper of turning pages, were preserved the fuller records of Glorfindel's visions. The manuscripts, penned in silver ink upon leaves of Malorn, told of prophecies that reached far beyond the simple fate of one Wraith Lord. Elrond himself had hesitated to commit these words to parchment, for they spoke of dooms intertwined with the very foundations of the world. Yet preservation of knowledge, no matter how perilous, was the burden of the wise. In these hidden texts, the true scope of Glorfindel's foresight began to emerge like dawn breaking over distant mountains. The Witch-King's curse was but one thread in a vast tapestry of doom, a tapestry that encompassed the pride of Númenor, the corruption of the rings of power, and the tragic fate of those who sought to cheat death through dominion over others. The records spoke of visions where the Witch-King's immortality was revealed not as blessing, but as punishment, a sentence passed by powers greater than Sauron himself. His undying state was a reflection of Númenor's greatest sin, the attempt to grasp immortality through force rather than grace. Just as the kings of old had sought to sail west to claim the undying lands, so had the bearers of the Nine Rings sought to escape mortality through the power of gold and shadow. But immortality seized rather than given was no immortality at all. It was a hollow mockery, an existence caught between life and death like a note that rings forever without harmony or resolution. The Witch-King had become a living exemplar of this terrible truth, his very presence a reminder of what became of those who sought to transcend their mortal nature through means other than the grace of the Valar. As these ancient pages turned beneath the weight of centuries, they whispered of connections that spanned the ages, how the fall of Númenor had echoed forward through time, creating ripples that would eventually claim 9 kings in rings of gold and shadow. The curse binding the Witch-King was thus revealed as part of a greater pattern, a consequence of humanity's eternal struggle between acceptance of mortality and the desperate hunger for endless days. In the deep places of the world where the music of creation first took form, and the secret fire burned brightest, the 9 rings of power were wrought with hammer and song. Each ring was a masterwork of craft and malice, designed to ensnare the hearts of those who wore them with promises of dominion and immortality. But among all the rings, the one that would claim the king who became the Witch-King held a peculiar and terrible distinction. The forging was attended by portents that even Sauron in his pride should have heeded. As the gold flowed white-hot in the crucible, shadows danced unbidden around the forge, taking shapes that resembled not victory, but lamentation. The very metal seemed to resist the forming hammer as though it sensed the doom it would carry across the centuries. 9 kings of mortal men received these gifts, each believing himself chosen for greatness. They were rulers in their own right, wise in the ways of war and statecraft, mighty in the wielding of sword and scepter. Yet as the years passed and the ring's power flowed through their veins like liquid starlight, they began to fade from the living world, becoming wraiths caught between shadow and substance. But among the 9, the one who would become the Witch-King suffered a fate more profound than mere transformation. Where his brothers in darkness faded gradually into wraith form, retaining echoes of their former selves, he underwent a more complete metamorphosis. His soul became anchored in the void between worlds, neither fully claimed by death nor permitted to remain in life. This was not merely the result of his ring's power, though that was part of the binding. Deeper forces were at work, ancient judgments that had been pronounced before the first stone of Númenor was laid, before the first man had looked westward with longing in his heart. The Witch-King bore within his transformed essence the accumulated weight of his people's hubris, becoming a living symbol of the price demanded for defying the natural order of creation. Unlike his fellow Nazgûl, who remained bound to Sauron's will and sustained by his power, the Witch-King carried within himself a spark of independence, born from his unique curse. This curse made him nearly impossible to destroy through conventional means, for it was rooted not in the temporary dominion of the Dark Lord, but in the eternal laws that governed the music of existence itself. From the timeless halls beyond the circles of the world, where dwelt the Valar in majesty and wisdom, ancient eyes had watched the unfolding tragedy of mortal ambition with sorrow and foreknowledge. Even before the first ships of Númenor had been built, before the first crown had been set upon a mortal king's brow, the Valar had perceived the paths that pride would carve through the centuries of Middle-earth. In the gardens of Lorien, where time moved like honey and every flower bloomed eternal, Varda Elentari had woven starlight into patterns of prophecy and warning. These patterns, visible only to those who possessed the wisdom to read the language of light itself, spoke of judgments that would span the ages, not punishments born of wrath, but consequences flowing naturally from choices made in freedom. The ban of the Valar, that great edict which forbade mortals from sailing to the Undying Lands, was itself part of a greater web of cosmic law. It was not mere prohibition but protection, a barrier designed to shield both mortal and immortal from the terrible consequences of mixing what was never meant to be joined. Yet in their pride, the kings of Númenor had seen only restriction where wisdom offered preservation. This same principle governed the fate of those who accepted the Nine Rings. In seeking immortality through dominion rather than through the natural grace of acceptance and wisdom, they bound themselves to a fate worse than death. The Witch-King, as the greatest among them in pride and power, became the most thoroughly ensnared by this cosmic justice. Glorfindel's prophecy, viewed in this light, revealed itself as more than mere foresight. It was recognition of a doom decreed in the foundations of the world itself. The Witch-King could not be slain by ordinary means because his existence had become part of the fundamental order of things, a living reminder of the price of defying natural law. His immortality was not blessing but burden, not power but prison. Yet even the Valar, in their wisdom, had woven into this doom the seeds of eventual release. For justice, though inexorable, was tempered with mercy, and every curse carried within it the key to its own dissolution. The question that haunted even the timeless halls was whether, when that key was finally turned, the release it brought would lead to redemption or to something far more final and absolute. Across the long centuries of the Third Age, the Witch-King moved through Middle-earth like a shadow-seeking substance, a void searching for fulfillment that could never come. His conquests were legendary: the founding of Angmar, the destruction of Arnor, the spreading of darkness across the northern lands. Yet those who studied his movements with the wisdom of ages discerned in them a pattern that spoke of something deeper than mere malice or ambition. There was a restlessness to his wanderings, a quality that suggested not the contentment of a conqueror, but the endless searching of one who had lost something precious beyond all reckoning. In the ruins of Fornost, survivors spoke of hearing, in the deep watches of the night, a sound like weeping that came from no living throat. Even in victory, the Witch-King carried within himself the echo of an inconsolable grief. This grief was the price of his peculiar immortality. Where natural death would have brought either peace or just judgment, his curse suspended him in an eternal moment of dissolution, forever dying, never dead. His body could be destroyed, scattered to the winds, yet his essence remained tethered to the world by chains forged from his own choices and tempered in the fires of cosmic justice. Each time he was thought destroyed, each time his form was broken and his power scattered, he would slowly coalesce again, drawn back together by the weight of his unfinished doom. This was not regeneration as mortals understood it, but something far more terrible, a constant resurrection into the same state of tormented half-existence. Like a song that could never reach its resolution, a story that could never find its ending. The wise who observed this pattern understood that the Witch-King's seeming invulnerability was actually the very mechanism of his punishment. He could not die because death for him would have been mercy, and mercy could not come until certain conditions were met, conditions woven into the fabric of prophecy itself. His awareness of this doom grew with the passing centuries, transforming his arrogance into something approaching terror. For while he feared no mortal weapon, no army or stronghold, he had begun to suspect that his immortality was not the gift he had once believed it to be, but a cage whose bars were wrought from time itself. In the deepest vault of his fortress in Minas Morgul, surrounded by books stolen from the libraries of kings, and texts written in languages that had died with their speakers, the Witch-King sought understanding of his own nature. His fingers, visible now only as shadow-given form, traced across pages that spoke of prophecies and dooms, searching for some clue to the riddle of his existence. He had heard whispers of Glorfindel's words at Fornost, carried to him by spies and shadows, and in those words he sensed not merely prediction, but recognition, as though the Elf Lord had seen something in him that he himself could not perceive. The phrase "not by the hand of man" had lodged in his consciousness like a thorn, growing more painful with each passing year. In his pride, he had initially interpreted these words as confirmation of his invulnerability. What threat could women or children pose to one who commanded the shadows themselves? Yet as the centuries passed and his understanding deepened, a more troubling interpretation began to emerge. Perhaps the prophecy spoke not of his strength, but of his weakness. Not of what could not harm him, but of the specific manner in which his doom would finally come. This realization brought with it a fear unlike any he had known in life or on death. For the first time in centuries, the Witch-King understood that his immortality had limits, that there existed in the world conditions under which even his cursed existence could be brought to an end. Yet these conditions remained maddeningly unclear, hidden behind veils of prophecy and metaphor. He began to perceive his immortality not as conquest over death, but as postponement of judgment, a delay that made the eventual reckoning not less but more terrible. Like water building behind a dam, the weight of consequence grew with each passing year, until the eventual breaking would come not as gentle release but as catastrophic flood. In his darkest moments, surrounded by the silence of his lightless tower, the Witch-King wondered if his fate was to search eternally for the key to his own destruction, like a prisoner who had forgotten the location of his cell's key. The irony was as sharp as any blade. The very immortality he had sought to achieve had become the mechanism of a torment more exquisite than any mortal pain. The dawn of March 15th broke gray and terrible over the Pelennor fields, as though the very sun recoiled from the carnage that would unfold beneath its gaze. The air hung thick with more than morning mist. It carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled, of ancient dooms rushing like floodwaters toward their appointed hour. The Witch-King rode forth from the gates of Minas Tirith, no longer merely the commander of armies, but the unwitting instrument of his own destruction. His fell beast's wings cast shadows that seemed to devour the light itself, and where his breath touched the ground, frost formed despite the warmth of spring. He was terrible in his power, more fearsome than he had ever been, yet there was about him now the quality of an avalanche, immense in its destructive force, yet ultimately powerless to alter its own path toward inevitable collision. Before the gates of the White City, he encountered the figure that would prove his undoing, though neither recognized it in that moment. Dernhelm, who was Éowyn in disguise, stood small and defiant before his overwhelming might, her sword bright as a star in the gathering darkness. At her feet lay Merry Brandybuck, his blade already touched with the ancient magic of the Barrow Downs, magic old enough to wound even the deathless. The confrontation that followed was painted in fire and shadow across the gray sky. Yet it was not truly a battle between warrior and wraith, but the collision of prophecy and fulfillment, the moment when all the carefully woven threads of fate drew tight. When Éowyn cast back her helm and declared herself no man, she spoke words that resonated through the very foundations of the world, awakening echoes of the Valar's ancient decree. The blade that pierced the Witch-King's crown was not merely steel blessed by Dunedain smiths, but the instrument of cosmic justice delayed through centuries of waiting. As it struck, reality itself seemed to shudder, as though a string stretched to breaking had finally snapped. His crown shattered like ice in flame, and his robes collapsed as the shadow that had worn them was suddenly, violently, drawn away from the world. But his destruction was not the simple dissolution that mortal eyes perceived. In that moment of apparent death, The curse that had bound him for so long finally completed its circuit, and he was torn from the world, not into oblivion, but into something far more complex, a state of being that lay beyond the normal boundaries of existence and void. Where the Witch-King's spirit was cast upon his destruction, there existed no word in any tongue of Middle-earth to describe. It was not death as mortals knew it, for death brought either peace or judgment, and he found neither. Nor was it the grey halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the dead awaited their fate, for those halls were closed to those who had so thoroughly rejected the gift of mortality. Instead, he found himself in a place, if place it could be called, that existed in the spaces between spaces, in the silence between notes of the great music. Here, the laws that governed life and death held no sway, for this was the realm of the unfinished, the unresolved, the eternally suspended. It was a void that was not empty but pregnant with possibility and prevention in equal measure. In this terrible limbo, the Witch-King's consciousness persisted, but not as the focused will that had once commanded armies and toppled kingdoms. Instead, he existed as fragments scattered across the emptiness, memories without context, emotions without object, thoughts without thinker. He was dispersed, dissolved, yet somehow still aware of his dissolution. The curse that had bound him in life became his nature in this strange afterstate. He could neither gather himself back into coherence, nor fade entirely into non-being. He remained trapped in a moment of perpetual dissolution, experiencing again and again the shock of his destruction on the Pelennor fields, yet unable to move beyond that moment into whatever lay beyond. Time in this void moved strangely, if it moved at all. Centuries might have passed, or moments, there was no way to tell. The Witch-King's scattered essence drifted through formless eternity, neither suffering nor peaceful, neither conscious nor unconscious, but caught in a state that combined the worst aspects of both. Here was the final revelation of his curse's true nature. Not immortality as he had believed, but something far more subtle and terrible. The inability to complete any transition, to finish any journey, to reach any destination. He had become a living or unliving embodiment of incompletion itself. In the years that followed the War of the Ring, as the Fourth Age dawned bright with hope and renewal, there came to the ears of the wise certain rumors that troubled the peace of even the most learned counselors. From the farthest reaches of Middle-earth, from places where shadow still lingered despite Sauron's fall, came whispers of strange disturbances that defied easy explanation. Farmers in distant lands spoke of nights when their animals would not venture from their barns, when even the bravest dogs would whimper and hide from something that cast no shadow and made no sound. Travelers on lonely roads reported moments of inexplicable dread, as though they walked suddenly through spaces where something terrible had once passed, leaving behind an echo of its presence. The scholars of Minas Tirith, poring over their ancient texts in the lamplight, found references to prophecies that spoke not of single dooms, but of recurring patterns, shadows that would return in different forms across the turning of the ages. These texts suggested that the Witch-King's destruction had been not an ending, but a transformation, a scattering that might, under certain conditions, begin to coalesce once more. King Elisar himself, when presented with these reports, grew thoughtful and distant. In his face, those who knew him well could read the weight of royal sight, the burden of seeing further than those he ruled, of understanding connections that remained hidden from lesser minds. He spoke little of what he perceived, but his orders to strengthen the watch on the borders carried an urgency that suggested knowledge of threats not yet fully manifested. The Fourth Age, so long awaited as an era of peace and healing, thus carried within its brightness the seeds of future shadow. For the Witch-King's curse had been not merely personal, but emblematic, a warning written in darkness across the sky of fate. His fate was bound to that of all mortals who sought to escape their nature through force rather than wisdom, and such seekers would rise again in ages yet to come. The wise understood that his story was not complete, that somewhere in the spaces between being and unbeing, the scattered fragments of his essence waited for conditions that might allow their reconvergence. The prophecy of Glorfindel had been fulfilled, but prophecies, like songs, often echo long after their apparent ending. In a chamber high in the towers of Rivendell, where the light of Arundel's star shone brightest in the hour before dawn, There lay a manuscript that had never been shared with mortal eyes. Written in Glorfindel's own hand upon leaves of gold, it contained the fuller vision that had come to him, not after the Battle of Fornos, but in the deep watches of the night many years before. A vision of such scope and terrible clarity that he had hesitated to speak of it even to Elrond himself. This hidden prophecy spoke not merely of the Witch-King's doom, but of the fate that awaited all who followed the path he had chosen. It was a vision that encompassed the rise and fall of civilizations, the endless cycle of mortality's rebellion against its own nature, and the price that such rebellion exacted from the fabric of creation itself. In this greater prophecy, the Witch-King was revealed not as a unique monster, but as the first and greatest example of a recurring pattern. A pattern that would repeat itself across the ages in different forms, but with the same essential tragedy. He was the archetype of the mortal who, in seeking to transcend mortality, becomes trapped in something worse than death. Glorfindel's vision had shown him processions of kings and conquerors across future ages, each seeking in their own way the immortality that the Witch-King had achieved, and each discovering too late that what they sought was not life eternal, but existence without peace. The prophecy spoke of necromancers and dark sorcerers, of tyrants who would try to bind their spirits to the world through force of will, of wise men who would be led astray by the lure of knowledge that promised power over death itself. But the vision also contained hope, for it revealed that each such tragedy carried within it the seeds of its own resolution. The Witch-King's doom at the hands of those he had deemed powerless, a woman and a hobbit, was not merely the fulfillment of a specific curse, but the demonstration of a universal principle, that pride and power, no matter how great, must ultimately yield to courage and sacrifice, no matter how small. This greater prophecy explained why Glorfindel had spoken so carefully at Fornost, wrapping his knowledge in riddles and metaphors. The full truth was too vast and terrible for most minds to bear, yet it needed to be preserved for those who would come after, who would face their own versions of the Witch-King's temptation and need wisdom to recognize the true nature of the choice before them. Thus we come to the end of our tale. Though endings, like shadows, are often more complex than they appear, the Witch-King's legacy echoes still through the halls of memory, not as the story of a conquered enemy, but as a warning carved in darkness across the sky of ages. His name has become synonymous with the terrible price of seeking immortality through dominion rather than through grace, of attempting to cheat death rather than accepting it as the gift it was always meant to be. In the deep places of the world where ancient knowledge sleeps beneath layers of dust and time, his story is preserved not as history, but as parable, a tale told to remind the wise that there are fates worse than death, and that the greatest victories are often won not by those who seem mightiest, but by those who have the courage to sacrifice themselves for others. The question that haunted his existence, what becomes of those who cannot die yet, cannot live, remains as relevant in our age as it was in his. For the temptation to seek power over mortality, to grasp at immortality through force rather than accepting it as grace, is written into the very nature of mortal hearts. Each generation must face anew the choice between the path of the Witch-King and the path of those who defeated him. His scattered essence, drifting still in the void between being and unbeing, serves as both warning and reminder. It whispers to us across the centuries that true immortality cannot be seized but only received, cannot be commanded but only accepted as a gift from powers greater than our own understanding. The crown that he wore in pride became the instrument of his destruction, just as the power he wielded in arrogance became the mechanism of his curse. Yet even in his doom there was a kind of mercy, for his destruction freed not only Middle-earth from his shadow, but freed him from the terrible burden of existence without peace. In being unmade, he was perhaps in some way that transcends our understanding, finally allowed to find the rest that his cursed immortality had so long denied him. Let this tale settle now into the quiet places of your mind, carrying with it the weight of ancient wisdom and the gentle warning of shadows overcome. For in the end, the greatest magic is not in seeking to escape our mortality, but in learning to live fully within it, finding in the acceptance of our finite nature the key to a peace that no earthly power can destroy. And so our journey through shadow and prophecy draws to its close, dear dreamer. The Witch-King's tale, with all its darkness and complexity, fades now into the gentle realm of sleep, carrying its ancient warnings and timeless wisdom into the sanctuary of your dreams. Remember, as you drift into slumber's embrace, that the greatest victories are often won not by sword or sorcery, but by the courage to face our fears, the wisdom to accept our limitations, and the love that drives us to sacrifice for others. In these simple truths lies a magic more powerful than any ring of power, a immortality more lasting than any curse. Let the weight of ages settle softly around you like a familiar blanket, and may your dreams be filled not with shadows, but with the light that overcomes them. Rest now, keeper of secrets, guardian of lore. The ancient tales will wait for your return, and the wisdom they contain will remain eternal and unchanging in the halls of memory. Sleep well, and may the stars shine upon your dreams.